the new introduction to the Junius Pamphlet. When the Communist International held its first gathering in Moscow on March 2nd, 1919, Lenin took to the podium and proclaimed the following words: "On behalf of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, I declare the first Congress of the Communist International open. First, I would ask all representatives present to rise in tribute to the finest representatives of the Third International, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg." They had died just a few weeks before, ruthlessly murdered by socialists who had been handed power amid the chaos of Germany at the end of the First World War and would eventually create the Weimar Republic. It is tragic the way Rosa Luxemburg is now remembered by leftists in the West. Among the pink and blue-haired, body-pierced anti-populists who consider any talk of economic struggle as class reductionism, Rosa Luxemburg's face can occasionally be found on buttons, adorned next to transgender symbols and rainbow flags. You see Rosa Luxemburg was a woman, after all. She wasn't one of those dead white men. And most importantly, she never took power. If the Spartacus Bund had been successful in 1919 and Rosa Luxemburg had ended up leading some kind of revolutionary government in Germany, you can be sure the New York Times and the woke college professors would accuse her of violating human rights or being authoritarian. But Rosa Luxemburg died, and thus she got a clean record. She is an empty vessel. If only Rosa Luxemburg had won, it would have been real communism, you can be sure many young feminist Marxists have said. It helps their case that Rosa Luxemburg criticized Lenin and rejected his concept of the vanguard party. However, aside from a few choice quotes that seem to line up with liberal anti-Stalinism, they do not understand what this debate was about either. The tragic and infuriating reality is that the people who now preserve Rosa Luxemburg's memory are the modern practitioners and equivalents of the people who killed her. The most horrific example is the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, a socialist policy lobby funded by the taxpayer dollars of the German state. The organization repeats NATO propaganda against Russia and even has offices maintained in Tel Aviv. Socialists, who exist as appendages of the Western colonial governments, giving them a more humanitarian edge while promoting their wars, are exactly what Rosa Luxemburg spent her life opposing, a fight for which she ultimately gave her life. To rescue Rosa Luxemburg's memory and the message of her work from the fools and deceivers who have hijacked it is exactly why we are republishing her most brilliant and widely circulated text, the Junius Pamphlet, The Crisis of Social Democracy. It's a pamphlet that speaks to the realities that ring true far more loudly in our time than when she wrote them. Rosa Luxemburg was born to a Jewish family in Poland. As a result of a childhood illness, she walked with a limp for her entire life. In a time when women were not encouraged to get an education and study, she proved herself to have an exceptionally sharp mind. When she was confined in the hospital as a child of 5 years old, she taught herself to read and write. As a teen, she studied economics and got involved with Marxist politics that were growing in popularity among European intellectuals. In her final year of high school, she was denied a gold medal for academic achievement because of her involvement in radical organizations, deeming her to be not in proper moral standing to receive the award. She went on to study political economy at the University of Zurich, and she became the first Polish woman ever to receive a PhD in political economy. She returned to Poland and became a well-known writer and organizer among Polish radicals. The popular trend among Polish Marxists was to advocate for independence from the Russian Empire. Marx himself had given his blessing to the nationalist movement. Rosa Luxemburg had the courage to disagree. Based on her analysis of the Polish economy, she could see that breaking away from Russia would not be to Poland's economic benefit. She argued that instead, Poland should join with other peoples of Eurasia in joint socialist development, with workers of different nationalities joining together. Rosa Luxemburg's doctoral dissertation, The Industrial Development of Poland, was widely circulated and infuriated the Marxist community. How dare she not embrace the trendy cause of the era? Lenin and others vehemently denounced her position, but history has now shown that she was correct, not in her assertions about the national question overall, but in relation to Poland. Polish nationalism, like many, quote, revolutionary movements throughout the European mainland at the time, was being manipulated by intelligence forces. The British Empire had long sought to repel any Russian influence on the European mainland. The greatest fear of the British has always been a German-Russian alliance, as it would spell the end of their domination of the world economy. When Poland was a socialist country, as part of the Warsaw Pact, developing in coordination with the Soviet Union and other countries, it experienced massive economic expansion. The fall of the Eastern Bloc, separating Poland from Russia and tying it to the West, made life much worse for the Polish people. The dock workers, who were organized to work against socialism by the CIA-backed Solidarity Union, lost their jobs in the 1990s. The strength of the Soviet Union was Stalin's ability to unify the different nationalities of Great Russia. The way different peoples, especially those of Slavic heritage, have been divided has not benefited them historically. Russian President Putin has consistently criticized Lenin for his fixation on national differences, saying they dreamt of a world revolution that would wipe out national states. That is why they were so generous in drawing borders and bestowing territories to national republics. He has elsewhere said they planted an atomic bomb under the building that is called Russia, and which would later explode. The virus of nationalist ambitions is still with us, and the landmine laid at the initial stage. Just like Marxist groups today avoid opposing the danger of a new world war, but run to protest Trump or against ICE or in favor of LGBT or Black Lives Matter, almost on command by CNN, the Marxists of Poland, with money covertly funneled by British intelligence, were rallying around the trendy liberal cause of breaking Poland away from Russia. Rosa Luxemburg said the focus should be on organizing a workers' movement and fighting for economic demands. And of course, this made her unpopular. Rosa Luxemburg's rejection of Lenin and his concept of the Party of New Type must be understood in the context of her work, The Mass Strike. Luxemburg observed how in revolutionary crises, the masses are suddenly emboldened with a new sense of bravery and courage. While strikes tend to involve a labor union against an employer, the mass strike phenomenon involves entire cities being swept into a state of revolt. Luxemburg's writing on mass strikes explains, quote, "The mass strike is not artificially made, not decided at random, not propagated, but it is a historical phenomenon which, at a given moment, results from social conditions with historical inevitability. The rigid, mechanical, bureaucrat conception cannot conceive of the struggle save as the product of organization at a certain stage of its strength. On the contrary, the living, dialectical explanation makes the organization the product of the struggle. The masses are the decisive element, and they are the rock on which the final victory of the revolution will be built." Lenin seems to have shared her sentiments to some degree, writing, "Revolutions are festivals of the oppressed and exploited. At no other time are the masses of the people in a position to come forward so actively as the creators of a new social order as at the time of revolution. At such times, people are capable of performing miracles." Rosa Luxemburg thus approached Lenin's call for a highly disciplined organization with a single newspaper, rather than privately owned presses, and a strict ironclad discipline, with suspicion. She feared it would suppress the spontaneity she had studied and celebrated so much. It is important to remember Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin were talking about building revolutionary movements in very different circumstances. Lenin's Party of New Type would have to function under illegality, in the context of czarist autocracy among a population that was still largely agrarian and illiterate. Rosa Luxemburg's work and understanding of how to organize were largely based on her experiences in Germany, which had already industrialized and had a vast legal Marxist movement and network of labor unions. Rosa Luxemburg was organizing in the Western liberal context. She wrote, "The ultra-centralism advocated by Lenin is full of the sterile spirit of the overseer. He is concerned not with the creative spirit of the proletariat, but with the control of party activity." Rosa Luxemburg moved to Germany around the turn of the century because it was the center of the global Marxist movement. She obtained German citizenship through marriage and worked in Berlin as an educator, teaching daily classes on Marxist theory to labor union members, community organizers, and others who struggled to learn the important concepts such as surplus value, overproduction, and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, all of which have long been forgotten by the woke Marxists of today, who think all Marxism consists of is bemoaning the unfairness of employee and employer relations. Marx's understanding that capitalism is constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thus exacerbating its built-in weaknesses, making the economy less and less stable, is more relevant than ever in the age of AI, the gig economy, and the ever-present decline of Western economies. Rosa Luxemburg understood these concepts better than anyone and taught thousands of people to know them for themselves. Rosa Luxemburg flourished in the fight against Edward Bernstein, who proposed to water Marxism down into liberal reformism. Her text, Reform or Revolution, relied primarily on economic data to show that universal male suffrage was not causing the Western countries to gradually turn into socialism bit by bit, and that all the problems of poverty amid plenty still applied. Karl Kautsky, the big boss of German Marxism, had no love for Rosa Luxemburg. Kautsky was often dubbed the Pope of Marxism and had worked closely with Engels and published many of Marx's works posthumously. Kautsky set the line of the German Social Democratic Party in the Second International, and as the First World War was on the horizon, he assured everyone there was nothing to worry about. With his theory of ultra-imperialism, he claimed that the rise in military spending was no cause for alarm, and that the colonial powers would simply form a cartel, much like the big banks. Rosa Luxemburg disagreed. She had developed her own understanding of economics of imperialism, explained in her book, The Accumulation of Capital. Her ideas were similar but different from Vladimir Lenin's concept of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. On the fundamental points, they agreed. Western monopolies were stretching their tentacles across the world, seizing new markets to prevent a crisis of overproduction, and in the process, keeping Eastern nations in poverty and destroying their domestic industries. Where Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin diverged is that Luxemburg saw the phenomenon as a much more long-standing economic reality, whereas Lenin marked the 1890s as a turning point. Some of what Luxemburg wrote, drawing from Marx's understanding of colonialism as primitive accumulation and imperialism being almost intrinsic to capitalism from the beginning, brings to mind the work of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the leader of the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement in America, and his understanding of the colonial mode of production. Regardless, the German authorities prosecuted Rosa Luxemburg for urging young German men to refuse military service. She was accused of spreading disinformation about the army by highlighting the abusive, dehumanizing, and degrading practices enlisted men were subjected to. Her trial and appeal quickly backfired on the authorities, and they had hoped to silence her. But testimonies from thousands of former soldiers about the horrific realities of German militarism amplified her message from the witness stand. Rosa Luxemburg became a kind of socialist celebrity, speaking across Germany about the danger of a new world war, a danger her boss, Karl Kautsky, refused to recognize, and the need to oppose the militarization of society. When the First World War broke out on August of 1914, Rosa Luxemburg was rounded up as a noted anti-war voice. From prison, she composed this pamphlet, her most widely studied economic work. Her pamphlet explained in detail the economic causes of the First World War as the colonial powers battled for control of world markets, and condemned the leaders of the Marxist movement who had sold out and betrayed their anti-war pledges and were actively cooperating with the most horrific war humanity had yet seen. The pseudonym she used, Junius, was an homage to Lucius Junius Brutus, who had defended the Roman Republic from an attempt to restore the monarchy, much as she opposed Germany collapsing into authoritarian military rule amid the horrendous war. Rosa warned that the economic causes of the war wouldn't go away, and that this kind of ugly barbarism would become more and more part of life. She warned that Europe was headed the way of the Roman Empire. Friedrich Engels once said, bourgeois society stands at a crossroads, either a transition to socialism or a regression into barbarism. What does regression into barbarism mean to our lofty European civilization? Until now, we have all probably read and repeated these words thoughtlessly without suspecting their fearsome seriousness. A look around us at this moment shows what the regression of bourgeois society into barbarism means. This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war. But then, when the period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses toward its inevitable consequences. Today, we face the choice exactly as Friedrich Engels foresaw it a generation ago. Either the triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery, or the victory of socialism. And that means the conscious, active struggle of the international proletariat against imperialism and its methods of war. This is the dilemma of world history, an either or. The scales are wavering before the decision of the class-conscious proletariat. The future of civilization and humanity depends on whether or not the proletariat resolves manfully to throw its revolutionary broadsword into the scales. In this war, imperialism has won. Its bloody sword of genocide has brutally tilted the scale toward the abyss of misery. The only compensation for all the misery and all the shame would be if we learn from the war how the proletariat can seize mastery of its own destiny and escape the role of lackeys of the ruling classes. She was released amid the chaos of Germany's defeat in 1918. The sailors and then the army itself were in a state of revolt. The Social Democrats and labor unions were essentially handed control of the government. Kautsky, Ebert, Schneiderman, Nosk, and other bigwig social traitors who had supported the First World War now had the task of making sure that the revolution among the German people, as a horrific war ended, did not lead to anything good. With white hair and a frail condition from years of imprisonment, Rosa Luxemburg joined other revolutionaries to merge the Spartacus Bund into the German Communist Party on January 1st, 1919. While she had been critical of Lenin, she looked to Soviet Russia for inspiration and wanted to establish a Germany that would align with it. When labor unionists in Berlin, affiliated with the Independent Social Democratic Party, went on strike, opposing plans to create a new capitalist constitution in Weimar, but wanting a socialist country, on January 5th, the result was much bigger than expected. Workers across Berlin went on strike, and the demonstrations swelled into the hundreds of thousands. A revolutionary committee was elected, and it began acting as the de facto government of Berlin. Gustav Nosk, a social democrat, was given command of the military and began negotiating with the Revolutionary Committee about what came next, as Berlin was in a state of dual power. Nosk eventually brought in the military and retook Berlin from the Revolutionary Committee. After the revolt was crushed on January 13th, militias of anti-communist soldiers called Freikorps, or free officers, began roaming the streets of Berlin, attacking communists. Posters were put up all over the city calling for Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht to be killed. On January 15th, Rosa Luxemburg was discovered in an apartment with Karl Liebknecht in Berlin's Wilmersdorf district. She was arrested by the Freikorps and taken to the Eden Hotel, which was functioning as a kind of temporary prison for the military. She and Liebknecht were interrogated and shot. Her body was dumped into the Landwehr Canal. This was an extrajudicial killing done at the behest of socialists who cooperated with anti-communist militias. Gustav Nosk later claimed he had not ordered the two to be killed, but that the captain had acted without his permission. Anger swelled in the streets following the kidnapping and assassination. The German military staged a trial, hoping to appease the public. The main perpetrators, who insisted they were acting on orders from Gustav Nosk, were never charged. One lieutenant, Kurt Vogel, received a 2-year prison sentence for illegally disposing of Rosa Luxemburg's body. He was broken out of prison by members of the German military. This book contains the text of Rosa Luxemburg's famous anti-war pamphlet, laying out the causes of the First World War and calling out the socialists who supported it, debunking their false claims. This text is the translation of Dave Hollis, posted to the Marxist Internet Archive in the public domain with permission granted to copy and distribute. We have included the powerfully worded manifesto published in December of 1918, right after Rosa Luxemburg was released from prison, What Does the Spartacus League Want?, as well as Lenin's famous essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, condemning the Social Democrats' betrayal and explaining its economic basis, the aristocracy of labor. We republished this piece of important history shortly after the publication of Mystical Stalinism and the Struggle Against Revisionism in America because it is extremely relevant. Socialism in America repeats war propaganda against Russia, China, Iran, etc. Socialists are better defenders of the bourgeoisie today than the bourgeoisie themselves, slandering, defaming, and threatening violence against anyone who opposes the danger of a new world war. When the Uhuru movement were indicted and nearly imprisoned just for their anti-war speech, the socialists refused to support them. Socialism in America, just like German social democracy, is nothing more than a wing of the imperialist system. In these times, the Center for Political Innovation emphasizes the economics of decaying capitalism and the need for a government of action that fights for working families. We are doing as Lenin said, not begging for a seat at the social imperialist table, but going lower and deeper to the real masses, with an ideology not tainted by the destructive spirit that accompanies the Marxist philosophy, while embracing and studying the new economy rising from anti-colonial revolutions around the world. The Center for Political Innovation marches ahead. We take with us the great example, as well as the intellectual contributions of Rosa Luxemburg, a brilliant political economist and activist who, like us, refused to conform to the trendy radicalism of her day and made great sacrifices. She was not willing to be part of the movement that functioned as a leftist face for imperialism. Neither are we. And that is my introduction to our republication of the Junius Pamphlet by Rosa Luxemburg. And you can read the whole thing for yourself. It's got the whole pamphlet plus the 2 additional appendix pieces. So check out the Junius Pamphlet, the new edition of that the Center for Political Innovation has published.